Hello, hello. We are live with I guess, what number is this? 33? I've done a lot of these developer workshops highlighting all the developer tools on Linea. I'm really excited to, I guess, introduce. I'm not going to introduce you for yourself, but I guess this is where I start. I'm Emily. I do DevRel at Linea. Um, Lovely guest. Please introduce yourself and what you're working on.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Tabasco. Although that's not my real name. My real name is Ethan. I do developer relations at Particle, so I handle all of our documentation, all of our uh, technical videos, and go to events, and of course do stuff like this. I've been doing developer relations now for a little bit over 2 years. Been kind of full time in this space now for I think getting closer to 4 years. Previously, I was at an RPC provider called ChainStack, and I led developer relations over there for about a year and a half. And then I joined Particle back in September, and we've kind of done a lot since then. Kind of the quick TLDR, and I'll get into it a little bit later. But Particle Network, we basically do a lot of different UX facing technology, so things that kind of simplify the onboarding and interaction experience for end users and kind of infrastructurally set the stage for what we hope at least to be sort of a large scale of onboarding in terms of kind of creating an environment in which it's kind of approachable for new users to get into the space. So we do this a lot through social logins and account abstraction and things that kind of help people get into Web3 and then start using it in a way that's pretty simple. So we've been around now for 2 or 3 years, and we've kind of grown pretty quickly to be one of the largest kind of abstraction providers on Linea, as well as a few other EVM chains. So super excited for this. I think that there's a few angles here that we can kind of get into and start exploring the kind of abstraction space.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, that was kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about. I don't know if this is what you've already addressed in your slides and we can pull that up or you just want to chat, but yeah, I don't know. Give us the rundown. Right?
Sure. Yeah. Let me move over to my monitor here. Yeah. So what I wanted to kind of go through today, at least in the context of kind of what I just established, is sort of like this idea of building consumer ready applications on Linea, leveraging account abstraction. So like for a long time, we've always kind of had this idea as a space of sort of building applications that are ready for consumer onboarding. But like what does that necessarily mean? I think it starts almost always at kind of like the initial point of like getting into an application, and then even extending past that into the actual process of interacting with that application. So this is where ERC-4337 and like a kind of abstraction tying this in with social logins kind of comes in play, because as we'll get into a moment, the kind of ideal user experience is whenever a user can log in like 2 clicks into a smart account, start leveraging the application. Ideally, they don't even pay gas fees. Sometimes they don't even actually sign transactions. And at this point, you start approaching this user experience like a user doesn't really know that the applications they're using is actually Web3. And this is really what we like, at least as an industry, what we want to get to. It's like users should be able to like leverage dApps and leverage the benefits of Web3 without the kind of friction and sort of new tooling that is usually associated with using Web3. So users can kind of manage in a way that it feels very familiar, feels very Web2 like, and this is what account abstraction and social logins enables to a pretty significant degree. So I have an introduction slide, but as I mentioned, I do developer relations here at Particle, and I've been doing it for a little while, and I'm pretty excited to kind of dive into a few of these concepts. First of all, what I want to do is kind of establish sort of like an overall term that typically kind of addresses this idea of onboarding into an application via social login, and as we'll get into tying in a kind of abstraction to this flow. So this term is called wallet as a service. Now you might have heard of this before. There's a lot of different kind of providers, creating wallet as a service products in the space, primarily like with the ultimate goal of allowing user to onboard into an application using their social account. So this is kind of like the common denominator between all wallet as a service products. It's like, how do you get a user into an application as fast as possible, using means in which they're already familiar with. So, for example, like, going into an application using my Google account or my Twitter account or my email, and then actually from that onboarding process, like the same process that I'd be doing in Web2, actually having a wallet that I can then use and kind of interact with the application with. So this is actually a pretty cool kind of like a dynamic within applications that's been popping up recently. And, of course, we're not the only ones to do this. You might be familiar with Web3 Auth or Privy or other kind of organizations that also do wallet as a service, in the context of, through some mechanism or another, having users onboard into custom made wallets through the means of social logins. These are usually secured by some sort of like alternative key management mechanism. In our case, we use MPC TSS, which basically just kind of like generates a private key, splits it into multiple shares, and kind of saves shares in like a user storage location as well as a server storage location. Then, like long story short, basically independently leverages these shares to generate a signature. You have a few other kind of wallet service providers that do similar things in terms of like, taking a private key and distributing it across different locations and then reunifying it to sign a transaction. Like all that said, kind of the idea behind what actually makes it possible to like in 2 clicks log in with Google and then have a wallet that you're going to use. It all comes down to how you actually generate and manage that private key. So there's a lot of really cool mechanisms today where you can do this in a way that's still non-custodial and gives users a lot of control over their wallet, the full self-sovereignty and everything, and of course without the risk attached to kind of a custodial approach. So in our case, we use MPC TSS, but there's a few other kind of cryptographic mechanisms of kind of enabling this key distribution that then thereby allows you to log in via social login. So this is the idea of wallet as a service. It's using alternative key management mechanisms to allow users to, using their kind of familiar Web2 accounts, log into an application and start using it with kind of an embedded wallet. So speaking of an embedded wallet, this is kind of, when you're using MetaMask or Phantom or anything like this, like typically what you're going to be doing is using the wallet extension on your browser to then interact with the application. Or if you're using your mobile app, then using the application interface on your phone. But like in a scenario where you're logging into an application using your social login, and you're having a key that's distributed and it's kind of generated for you on the back end, you don't really know what the seed phrase is by default. You're just using the wallet. In this case, like how as a user do you actually like have a wallet interface with all your balances and everything, right? Well, there's kind of 2 ways that you can do this. The first is that, of course, applications can kind of manage this themselves. So there's a lot of applications that use wallet as a service, do social logins, and then they do all of the balance displays and all of kind of the address displays on their front end. And I'll actually showcase an example of this in a moment. Alternatively, another pretty common denominator between wallet service products is this idea of embedded wallets. So actually having an interface that's natively embedded in the application itself that allows you to interact with the wallet and kind of like leverage it as if you were to have MetaMask installed or something like that. So this is quite important because this means that you can have an experience that's pretty parallel to any typical like extension-based wallet or app-based wallet, but of course in this case through the means of like just social logins. So this is a pretty big removal of the barrier to entry for end users because just imagining the onboarding process, between wallet-based onboarding and social login-based onboarding is that, for example, with a typical wallet, you download the extension, you create a new wallet, you have a seed phrase, you have to write the seed phrase down, place this into a secure location, like physically. Then you have this wallet, you go to an application, you connect it, you sign transactions through this wallet extension. And this is kind of a difficult process for a lot of new users to grasp. So alternatively, within the kind of mechanism of wallet service, which is, again, this term that refers to this overall technology, rather a user goes to an application, they sign in with a Google account, they have an address that's given to them. They don't need to manage the seed phrase because, again, they're using this alternative key management mechanism. Then they have this kind of embedded interface that they can use to interact with the wallet, to view all their balances, to view their address, and that's it. They don't need to download anything. They don't need to learn how to use a different wallet interface. They don't need to, write down a seed phrase. It's all done for them. And of course, in this case, kind of the goal is to ideally create an experience that feels very parallel to Web 2 and kind of removes a lot of the additional friction that's typically associated with Web 3. And this is very commonly attached to account abstraction, as we'll get into in a moment, and kind of unified in a way that makes it very easy for developers to integrate, which we'll also get into. But the kind of idealist scenario here is that like a developer integrates it in 5 or 10 lines of code, they add it into their application, they have full compatibility for it, which then therefore allows users to interact with that application via their social account. So this is quite an important component. So this is kind of like a visual example of, that tangent that I went on, which is just kind of like this idea of, in this case, onboarding via my Google account in this application. As you can see, this is an application called Apex Pro. This is just like a standard example that I typically use because they're kind of like a perp trading DeFi platform. And as you can see here in this kind of GIF, what I did is I onboarded via my Google account. This then kind of brought me into their application. I have my address there in the top right. So kind of see the GIF loop back around here. So I select that account. I'm now into the application. I have my address there. I can view my assets, my total assets in USC. I can deposit, transfer assets, stuff like that, or I can click the Manage Wallet button, which then pops up the embedded wallet interface from Particle. So there's a lot of kind of really cool implications here. And of course, this whole interaction that I'm doing right here, no downloads. This is like 2 clicks essentially, and quite simple. So this is a pretty big removal of the typical barriers that you might find with UX, because again, this is what would be like a 10-20 minute process for kind of getting a wallet set up and creating an account, versus in this case basically 30 seconds to kind of log in with your social account and therefore start using a wallet. So this is a kind of a pretty important dynamic for developers, especially when you're creating an application that is consumer ready or consumer facing in any regard. So if you're kind of creating a game or a DeFi platform or anything that you want general consumers to be able to access, social logins can be a pretty significant kind of enabler of these consumers to use your application. I mean, even myself, whenever I go to an application, I see social logins as one of the options. A lot of times I'll choose that over my wallet because it's just easier. So this is a pretty big, unlock for applications that want to have this kind of more consumer facing nature. And this is, of course, why wallet as a service exists. And this has been kind of our focus for a long time at Particle. But wallet as a service as a base product has a lot of limitations, because what you're doing at the end of the day is you're onboarding a user into an externally owned account, which for some context, an externally owned account is bound by a private key. In the case of wallet as a service, it's a distributed private key, typically, like I mentioned, but it's bound by a private key. It's a very standard, very rigid account structure that you can do a very set, limited number of things with. So you can do, standard peer-to-peer transactions. You can interact with contracts. You can kind of hold assets on your account, and that's about it. These accounts aren't programmable. They aren't very flexible. There's a lot of limitations in terms of what you can do. So while it's easy in this scenario to onboard a user into an account through wallet as a service, through social logins, you instantly hit a wall where it's like, okay, well, now that we have this user in the account, I mean, they can do standard transactions, but still we lack a lot of the UX kind of features that we need to actually achieve what you typically would consider a like truly consumer facing application, which requires more than just like this single step onboarding, because you need more features such as gaseous transactions and pop-up list transactions and programmable wallets to kind of customize the user experience to your specific application, and things that can further remove the Web3 experience from the end user and make it feel even more Web2 native. So this is kind of the principle and the idea behind smart wallet as a service, which is the same thing as wallet as a service, but kind of as I have here in this graphic, rather than kind of just having user, log in, have a private key generated by MPC TSS, which is the key management mechanism, then leveraging the EOA that results from that. What we actually do is we have that same process, but instead of ending there with the EOA, we then assign a smart account implementation such as Economy or Alchemy's Light account or Simple account or something of this nature. Then the user actually leverages the smart account implementation that's attached to the EOA generated by social login as kind of their main interface with the application. So maybe a little bit complicated there, but kind of the idea here is that, user 2 clicks, they onboard into an application. We generate a private key bound account, an EOA. Then we take this EOA, we assign it as kind of the signer or the owner of a smart account, and then the user leverages that resulting smart account within the application. And of course, this unlocks a lot of really cool things, because now that they're leveraging a smart account, not the EOA, they can do things like gaseous transactions and pump list transactions, and and introduce modules into their account. And the developer has a ton more flexibility in terms of what you can do with these accounts within your application. Like you could even go to a scenario where you actually create a custom smart account for your application with custom features or custom modules that are kind of tailor made to make the experience of your application better and more Web2 like. And this is really where you start getting into the kind of interesting UX implications of using account abstraction, using smart accounts rather than EOAs in the context of wallet as a service. So from a programmatic perspective, actually doing this is very simple. Like when you're creating an application and integrating social logins, the actual process of onboarding via social login and getting user into your application, kind of like what I showed with Apex, in terms of just like logging in via Google or Twitter. This is actually just one method through one React hook, and this is the connect method as I have here. You choose the social type that you want to connect with, the chain, in this case Linea. Then you can kind of establish a smart account. We have a full SDK just for using account abstraction, or you can use Economy's SDK or Alchemy's SDK or anything like this. You then kind of decide what smart account you want to use. Then you apply this to something like for example, EIP 1193 provider object through Ethers or Web3.js, or you can use this object directly to execute transactions and so on. So basically, in less than 20 lines of code, you can set up the whole onboarding process for users into your application via social logins, and extend this even further to account abstraction, do things like gasless transactions, popless transactions, and so on, really without much lift programmatically. So this is like a 1 hour addition to your project at max that can have some pretty significant UX implications, and of course, kind of make your application feel much more Web2 like, and kind of remove a lot of the typical complexity that's associated with Web3 from your application. So understanding kind of the idea of onboarding into an application via social login into an EOA, which then gets assigned to a smart account, which then you kind of use as the interface with their application. This is kind of an outline of how we structure this idea of smart wall as a service. So kind of the concept here is that we kind of have this very modular implementation where, if you're familiar with account abstraction, there's a ton of infrastructure that exists out there to make account abstraction possible within your application. There's a lot of different smart account implementations from, like I mentioned, Biconomy, Alchemy, Safe, ZeroDev, etc. A lot of different types of paymasters, a lot of different types of bundlers. Each of them have kind of different pros and cons, different types of implementations, and so on, different types of efficiency, especially with bundlers. So as a developer, like at Particle, we believe in this kind of modular approach where you can basically kind of use whatever infrastructure that you want to. You don't have to use our infrastructure. Now, we do have our own paymaster and our own bundler. We have the Particle Omnichain Paymaster and the Particle Bundler, which we use in all of our applications by default. But you have full freedom to use Biconomy's bundler or Pimlico or StockUp. Same thing with the paymasters. And for smart accounts, you can use any smart account implementation that you want. By default, within our SDKs, we support Biconomy, Simple Account, CyberConnect, Alchemy Light Account, and so on. But if you want to, you can plug in your own smart account implementation or really any other that exists out there. So it's quite simple in that case. And of course, because this is, again, tied in with social logins, which is what we call Particle Auth, this has a full embedded account abstraction wallet. So kind of that wallet modal on the application itself for users to interact with the wallet, and all of the benefits of kind of social logins and that kind of like Web2 native onboarding functionality. So this kind of graphic showcases the kind of dynamic between all these different components and kind of this modular approach of making it very kind of plug and play, but also retaining the ability to kind of use whatever infrastructure that you want. We believe this to be very important because as a developer, there really isn't like a one size fits all solution. So like when you're creating an application, you really want to hone in on the UX. Like it's clear that social logins make a pretty big impact to this. Account abstraction makes a pretty big impact to this. But the specifics of how you achieve this in terms of, what paymaster am I using, what bundler am I using, what smart account am I going to be using, how am I displaying the embedded wallet model, am I displaying the embedded wallet model? I mean, these different kind of core configurations, these are all very malleable and kind of up to you as a developer to create a very unique and kind of non-cookie cutter experience. So this is kind of how we formatted this whole idea of smart wall as a service in the context of our SDKs. So, like I mentioned, we do have this kind of very modular approach, but at the same time, we basically have all the infrastructure ourselves if you just want this very simple solution. So, we also kind of run, like I mentioned, our own bundler, paymaster, smart account. We have the whole user interaction side covered, as well as the key management side via MPC. So these are things that like you could take Particle and, like I mentioned earlier, 20 lines of code, have a full implementation ready to go, where you're still using the core benefits of account abstraction through kind of our standard plug and play solution, using all of our infrastructure, using social logins and so on. So this is a pretty cool kind of dynamic that we've also been quite focused on in terms of creating something that is not only like as simple as possible for users and developers to kind of integrate, but also kind of flexible enough to be able to add in any of these other kind of pieces of infrastructure that we have here on the list. And this is where this kind of second showcase graphic comes in. Whereas like, while the UX benefits here are clear, as the kind of sustainability of such a solution very much depends on the modularity and kind of the ability to implement external implementation. So this kind of graphic showcases that we have our native implementation, which is our own bundler, either Biconomy or our own paymaster, a number of different types of smart accounts. Of course, the signer being the EOA generated by social login. Or if you want to, you can use any other kind of combination of paymasters, bundlers, smart accounts. So that's kind of like hammering the point home there, where we believe kind of smart walls of service as an idea to be a very long-term solution that will drive a lot of kind of core adoption. And as a result, the flexibility has been kind of built in here to make sure that that's possible and not locked into us as kind of like a single vendor of all the infrastructure. So that's quite important. And as I mentioned, this whole process, this kind of like modular implementation of smart walls as a service, social logins plus account abstraction, the whole process of actually onboarding users through this mechanism, it's all very simple. And actually the overhead for the programmatic complexity is very low. In this case, what I have here on the GIF is actually a full application. It's around 120 lines of code. That's including all the JSX and everything. And this whole application handles all the onboarding, all of the like balance fetching and display, handling like 2 different types of user operations or transactions and so on. So this is quite a complex application, and all of it's built in under 100 lines of code. The actual usage of SDK here kind of spans less than 10 lines of code. So very simple and very easy to integrate as a developer, with of course added flexibility of kind of being able to use any infrastructure that you want to use and kind of customize the implementation to a pretty deep level. So this is kind of the idea behind Smart Wall as a Service. Now, with all that said, that kind of pretty deep explanation of how all that works and the actual implementation of the SDK and the usage of different infrastructure. What I also want to highlight is that at Particle, we see Smart Walls of Service and the onboarding of users via social logins into account abstraction wallets via MPC to be the first step in a larger goal of simplifying Web3's user experience. So actually what we're kind of focusing on and building right now at Particle is this idea of a universal account, which a universal account, like very simply put, addresses a lot of the multi-chain complexity. So when you look at Web3 and the kind of the dynamic of UX, we kind of see it in 2 different parts. So the first part is UX as it relates to onboarding and kind of low-level account interaction. This is addressed by account abstraction and social logins. Everything that I just talked about addresses the first half of this problem, which again is onboarding and kind of low-level interaction. So getting user into an account as easily as possible, as quickly as possible, and then kind of using the application through a flexible means. Like I mentioned, this is what smart accounts through account abstraction enables. So with this already being solved with Smart Walls of Service, like this half of the kind of UX problem or the kind of the UX dilemma in Web3 is already complete. Like applications that integrate account abstraction and social logins have an onboarding flow that is very much parallel to Web2 in terms of the underlying complexity. And it's been proven in terms of all these applications that use it, including a lot of applications on Linea that use our SDKs and kind of other providers as well. They onboard a pretty significant number of consumers and they have no problem doing this. But the issue is that once you start looking beyond the onboarding process and into the actual like cross-chain interaction and using multiple applications across the ecosystem, this is where the experience breaks down pretty significantly. Because even if you can onboard a user in 2 clicks into a smart account, into by using methods that they're familiar with in a way that's secure, non-custodial, super flexible, that's all great, right? But if the user, as soon as they actually try to go and use applications across different chains and even across different applications and what they originally onboarded into, this experience breaks down, right? So now if I want to go, for example, if I'm onboarding to an application on Linea, I want to go, to an application on Arbitrum, for example, right, or Base or something of this nature, and I have to go find a bridge. Linea has some really good bridges, but even then, as a user, I have to go find this bridge. I have to manually bridge. I have to do the transaction myself. I have to, wait a little bit of time, and sometimes it costs quite a bit of gas. I mean, it just depends on network conditions. Like this is a complicated user experience, and even past the need for manual bridging, I need to just like cognitively be aware of and manage multiple balances across different chains. So I have to say, how much ETH do I have on Linea? How much ETH do I have on Base? How much ETH do I have here and here? And this limits the growth potential of chains ultimately and the applications within it, because it means that users that are willing to bridge to your chain or bridge to your application and that are maintaining a balance in this environment, they're your user base. So you're kind of locked off from a big chunk of the ecosystem that doesn't want to do this manual bridging process and kind of move liquidity over to the chain and the environment in question. So this is a pretty big problem because onboarding users is fixed, but actually getting users to interact across the entire ecosystem is not doable for consumers because of the inherent complexity with multi-chain interaction. So like, well, how do you solve this? How do you actually take what we just discussed with this initial implementation of social logins and account abstraction and tie it into a solution that takes a more holistic approach to UX that also solves the multi-chain problem simultaneously? So Particle, our big focus is kind of number one, tying in all the components I just talked about a moment ago as it relates to social logins and account abstraction into this umbrella term of wallet abstraction. So we want to make it clear that it's easy to onboard via any account that you want to, any wallet that you want to, into a smart account, and do so in a way that kind of is falling under this term of wallet abstraction. So this is clear, but wallet abstraction, this idea, social logins and account abstraction, this ties into what we're building at the moment called a universal account. Now, a universal account, simply put, basically is an account structure. It's kind of an extension of ERC-4337 account abstraction wallets that allows you as a user to actually maintain one address and one balance across every chain. So I can have one ETH on Base, and the same Ether that I have on Base, I can use on Linea, and I can use on Arbitrum, I can use on Ethereum, and I can use anywhere because it's my balance, right? If I can have USDT on Base or on Linea, I can use that same USDT anywhere else. So this means as a user, I actually don't even need to be aware of what chain that the application is that I'm using. So if I'm using a Git application that's on Linea, and I have my liquidity on Base, then I don't need to be aware that this application is using Linea or that my balance isn't on Linea because I just use the application, right? And I can leverage the kind of unique benefits of Linea without needing to like go through the whole process of bridging or kind of being aware of this kind of multi-chain, lack of parity. So this represents a pretty interesting scenario for users because now we have this experience where ideally, a user onboards via social login into a smart account. They use a smart account across any chain, any application that integrates it, and they don't need to be aware of the balances that they have between chains. They just simply do transactions, they use applications, and that's it. So this not only makes it easier for end users, makes it easier for consumers, but also changes the whole like dynamic for applications because now applications aren't competing for a very limited amount of users in a given ecosystem or a given chain. Rather, the ecosystem is much more open. Chains can onboard more users into their applications. Applications have a huge pool of users now that span the entire Web3 ecosystem. And like growth overall becomes much easier for everybody without this kind of inherent fragmentation. So the future that we see is that using universal accounts, which are again an extension of smart contract wallets that are onboarded to via social logins or typical wallets, users will be able to onboard in 2 clicks and be able to use applications across the entire ecosystem without needing to manage multi-chain balances. And ideally, in a way that actually feels like Web 2 and feels like Web 3 is kind of invisible in this sense, or the complexity associated with Web 3 is invisible in this sense. And this is basically the removal of all of the main problems that we have with UX today. So this is really our focus at Particle and kind of what we're trying to achieve here in terms of taking what we've already built with social logins and account abstraction and moving it into this kind of user experience that is like a full addressal of Web3's points of friction from the onboarding side into the second half of the problem, which is the kind of multi-chain complexity, the cross-chain complexity, and the overall interaction process. So this kind of visualization here kind of encapsulates what I'm talking about here, where we want users to have one wallet, one kind of point of interaction, one set of assets. They can use any application that they want and achieve their goal through a very straightforward process that feels as natural as if they were using Web 2, rather than the current process, which is very complicated and pretty difficult. So this is kind of the future that we imagine and what we're kind of using as an extension of all the technology that I just talked about a moment ago. But of course, that's kind of still being built out. So what I want to talk about is kind of the base technology that I talked about in the first half of the presentation, which is social logins and account abstraction. So what I'm going to do is actually kind of go through a walkthrough programmatically how it's possible to integrate these SDKs and actually integrate social logins plus smart accounts in your application in like less than 20, 30 lines of added code. So this is going to be pretty interesting that I'll go through here. And this kind of QR code is actually going to directly lead to the application that I'm going to be kind of showing the code for. So if you scan this, this will lead to kind of a deployed applications I have. You can log in via your Google or your Twitter account, do transactions on Linea. These will be gasless transactions, kind of like a very simple showcase of the SDK. But let me go ahead and move my screen share here to my other screen. 1 second. There we go. All right, so first I'm going to kind of go through the application itself, and then I'll go through the code that kind of backs it. So let me screen share here, screen share the whole window. All right, let's see if this works. There we go. Cool, so let me actually go ahead and open the application. So I'm going to go through kind of 2 demos here. The first is going to be a demo using what we call our auth core SDK. So our auth core SDK is kind of the base SDK that enables social logins and account abstraction kind of across the entire stack. So this will kind of allow you to do like very direct, just like onboard by Google, Twitter, stuff like that. And of course, into any smart account implementation that you want to. So we have, of course, 2 options. We have a lot more, but for the sake of demonstration, I have 2 here. Sign up with X. If I choose to sign in with Google here, what I'll do is it'll open up my kind of Google authentication menu. I'll select this account right there. And 2 clicks here, I'm now into my wallet on Linea. So that was basically 15 seconds. I select my Google account. I'm into my wallet. I can see my balance in ETH. I can open up the particle embedded wallet modal right here, which is optional, but this is a pretty core thing that developers typically choose to include because it's one button that I can click. I can see all my balances on Linea, all my NFTs, my activity. I can send and receive. I can even do on-ramping and so on. So very simple kind of MetaMask-like interface that allows you to kind of manage your wallet. So now that I'm into this wallet through social login, I can of course use it as if I were to be using any other wallet. And of course, this is without any downloads. It's in 2 clicks, super simple. So what I'm going to do here is actually execute a transaction that is completely gasless on Linea Sepolia. So I'll do execute user operation here. This will then open up a quick modal that I can go ahead and confirm. So if I confirm this, then I believe I should have a transaction hash here in a moment. Once it gets confirmed, there we go. We have the transaction hash that is basically now confirmed on Linea Sepolia. So this is a gasless burn of around 0.001 ETH or something of this nature. So this is a full transaction. As you can see, the actual confirmation was handled within the application itself. So I don't need to open any other windows or any other kind of extensions or anything. It's all within the application, kind of contained here by the SDK. So if I refresh, then you can see that I have burned a little bit of ETH. Super simple. That was 2 seconds. And I can kind of open up my wallet modal here and kind of see the changed balance reflected here as well. So this is the idea behind Particle Auth Core. Particle Auth Core basically just allows you to kind of enable this very direct, onboarding by social login into smart accounts. And as you'll see here, programmatically, it's very, very simple. So this is Replit. Now, if you guys have used Replit before, it's my favorite tool for kind of doing browser side, cloud-based application hosting and whatnot. Basically, what I have here is I have kind of this cloud application that is React-based. It's super simple. What I'm actually doing here is I'm kind of handling my application in 2 different sections, one of which is in the index.tsx section. The index.tsx basically has our kind of core React component that actually configures Particle Auth. So what we have here is just kind of simply some like API keys for authentication. We're choosing the smart account implementation that we want to use. And of course, the chain that we want to be supported on the wallet, in this case, Linea Sepolia. Then I'm kind of wrapping my main application component right here. Then within my application component in app.tsx, I'm importing a few different React hooks, use Ethereum, use Connect, use Authcore from our Authcore SDK. I'm then using these React hooks to do things like, for example, connecting to the social login provider. If this is all handled within this function right here, it's one call. This call to the connect function, it initiates a connection with whatever OAuth mechanism I want to use. Google, Microsoft, Twitter, LinkedIn, Discord, whatever you want to do. It's all handled right here. I'm kind of defining this within social type and, of course, defining the chain that I want to onboard into as Linea Sepolia. I have the same kind of disconnect function all in one call. I can pull the user's kind of address, even their their actual Web2 information. So we have direct access to their potential their name, like in terms of the account they connect with, email, stuff like that. And what we also have here, which is quite important, is kind of what's powering this entire application, which is an EIP 1193 provider object. So if you're familiar with this kind of standard with EIP 1193, what we can basically do is through this kind of Ethereum provider object, we can plug this directly into the smart account object here, which is from our account abstraction SDK right here. And through the means of this, what we're doing is we're directly kind of introducing our EOA generated by social login into a smart account implementation, which is defined here by the smart account object. Again, we're throwing in some API authentication keys. We're defining the smart account that we want to use. I'm using a simple account instance, which is just the kind of standard smart account from the Ethereum Foundation. And this is all initialized now. With this smart account object, I now have a full smart account instance created through the EOA that we just generated through social login, all handled basically here, one React hook call, and then one kind of configuration of the smart account object. Then I'm creating a ethers provider right here using the smart account object. Also very simple. What we're just doing here is we're throwing the smart account implementation into like a standard ethers call, configuring an ethers provider, then using this ethers provider. I'm then kind of getting the addresses balance. I can send transactions the same way as if I were to do any transaction in any other application. Same syntax, same actual developer flow with ethers, It's just that, of course, in this case, it's being routed through our SDK and through a smart account. And this is all handled through kind of just very simply throwing in the provider object and creating the smart account object, and then, of course, creating an ethers provider as a result. So super simple stuff here. This entire application is in around 95 lines of code. If you remove all the JSX, it's 59 lines of code. And the idea here is that as a developer, you can add this functionality, this kind of social login functionality, especially if you're already using ethers or Web3.js or a VM. You can add this functionality in like less than 30 additional lines of code. So it's super simple in that case. Alternatively, what I also want to showcase is kind of the second example here, which I can actually open up right here. This is another SDK that we have, which ties pretty closely in with this idea of kind of like using any wallet to get into a smart account, called Particle Connect. So Particle Connect is essentially like our flagship sort of Rainbow Kit-like SDK that allows you to connect either, I think it's not, let me actually run it here. You can connect MetaMask or, Wallet Connect, Rainbow, stuff like that, alongside social logins within the same modal, very, Rainbow Kit-like modal, and then actually use this for a smart account. So I'll just connect right here. As you can see, I have a more kind of traditional connect wallet button right here. And within this interface, I have all my social logins. So email, phone, Facebook, Google, Apple, stuff like that. Then right below that, in the same interface, I have all my wallets. So OKX wallet, Bitget, Math wallet, MetaMask, stuff like that. So I can, as a user, choose if I have MetaMask, I want to use that. I click this, I can log in with my MetaMask. Or if I want to use social login and I prefer that, then I can use that here within the same interface. So this is quite important because now you're kind of offering more, experienced users a method of onboarding within your application, as well as more kind of consumer-facing users that maybe aren't familiar with kind of the wallet process within one SDK and one interface. So this is also kind of contributing to our idea here of like having one SDK and one kind of core mechanism of onboarding users into smart accounts, which of course will then, through our SDK, be eventually converted into universal accounts, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, will kind of span the entire ecosystem. But for now, what I want to do here is I can go ahead and select Google again. This will go through the same process as before. I can sign up with my Google account right here through kind of the Particle Connect interface. Then, as we have here, same balance I had before. I have my address, same embedded wallet modal. I think my replit went down. Let me launch it back up again. Let's see here. Maybe replit's down. Can you still hear me?
Oh, gotcha. I can hear you. Yeah.
I think there we go. Replit's back up. Sometimes my internet goes down for a few seconds and this can happen, but let me give it a chance just to kind of come back up here. But I guess while I'm waiting for Replit to launch again, what I'll do is kind of showcase actually Particle Connect in this case, which gives you more functionality than Particle Auth in this kind of scenario where you want to use both traditional wallets and social logins. It's actually easier to implement programmatically. So that whole kind of process, that connection process, is implemented again through a pretty standard React-based kind of component configuration. We're doing again some API keys, throwing in Linea as our desired chain, kind of deciding what wallets do we want to support within the modal. So do we want to support every EVM wallet? In this case, we're just kind of throwing in our wallet connect project ID here. Then we have 10 different wallets that we support. Choosing the smart account implementation that we want to use that happens after onboarding. So actually, whether I onboard with a social login or MetaMask doesn't matter, because still what's going to happen afterwards is that I'll kind of be onboarded into a smart account. So I can use that regardless of if I'm using MetaMask or social login or any other wallet, because again, it's kind of handled by the SDK, reflected through the SDK, and then of course within the embedded wallet model as well. Then I'm also defining Linea as kind of the chain supported within the wallet interface. Then same thing here, we're kind of wrapping our main application component. We can go to that over here. And very similarly to the same kind of application that we just looked at a moment ago, we're kind of pulling the EIP1193 provider object right here. We're throwing this into a smart account instance with our Abstraction SDK. We're then creating an ethers provider object, and same thing, fetching the user's balance, executing a transaction. This is actually the exact same syntax I just looked at a moment ago. But in this case, we're just kind of, rather than handling social logins through distinct functions, we're just throwing in a very simple connect button React component right here, which handles all the connection itself. So this is actually less, we can see here, we have two functions here, but if you look at removing the second function, around 57 lines of code for the same functionality as the last application, because we don't need to handle social logins ourselves. It's all done by the SDK in the back end. Users can onboard by any mechanism into a smart account, start using gasless transactions and pop-up transactions and so on super easily. So this is kind of like really a user experience that we've been advocating quite a bit for, because as you can see, I'm here now. I can open up my wallet modal right here. Again, same thing, see my balance and ETH on Linea. I can do transactions, same kind of mechanism as before, which will kind of open up a pop-up right here on the application. I can go click on confirm, and it'll be done on chain. Of course, if I had MetaMask connected here, then it would be requesting this on my MetaMask, but still super simple stuff. And of course, this is all within basically, in the case of Particle Connect, closer to like 15 lines of added code versus 20 to 30 for Particle Auth Core. So Particle Auth Core gives you more flexibility over like, do you want to facilitate social logins directly and like have like a custom interface for this and kind of like build your own UX logic around that? Or you can kind of like have it all be handled by us, just have a single connect button, social logins, wallets, tying into account abstraction wallets, all done in 15 lines of code. So this is a very powerful user experience that we're quite excited about. We think that of course, what the implications of this is that in the future, what's going to happen is that this user experience, this same flow of I choose my social login or I choose my my typical wallet, this will then lead into a universal account, which is a type of smart account that as a user, I won't know what chain I'm using. I won't know where my balances are. I won't need to know. I mean, I'll have the ability of knowing, but the knowledge of this will be unnecessary because I'll just use whatever application I want to use across the entire ecosystem, maintain a constant balance. And this is where you start kind of getting into this idea of users no longer have the onboarding complexity. They can choose whatever mechanism they want. 2 clicks if they want to via social logins. They then get into a smart account, which is intrinsically flexible. You can do kind of a lot of low-level, account flexibility things like gasless transactions and so on. And then extending this even further into the multi-chain issue, which now you have no issues across chains. You can have one balance for every different chain, leverage applications as if they're all in one chain, automatic bridging, stuff like this. And this is where you start getting into this like user experience that really will, we hope, propel Web3 into this scenario where it'll really be like viable for consumer onboarding, right? Because right now, all the problems I just mentioned are really the main blockers for us on a consumer level in terms of the viability of getting people into Web3. So with these solved, we think that this is where we're going to see some pretty significant onboarding, and hopefully the space as a whole will start to move in a much more kind of mainstream direction with the ability of onboarding users in such fashion. So this is, of course, something that we're very, very excited about. And we think that with the advent of universal accounts, which we actually just today, around 2 hours ago, had the testnet launch for our universal accounts. And we're going to have like a full mainnet, within a quarter or two. We think that this is going to contribute pretty significantly to kind of the mass onboarding of Web2 and Web3. And actually, like even further than that, I think the idea of onboarding Web2 and Web3 is interesting because hopefully what we're going to see is actually there won't really be any intentional onboarding. We're not going to have to onboard people because they're going to start using Web3 applications and actually not really know that they're using Web3 application. It's going to be seamlessly integrated into kind of the existing internet landscape. And of course, kind of propel Web3 into, like I mentioned, this kind of mainstream environment as a result. And we see social logins, account abstraction, and kind of chain abstraction as being these kind of 3 core technologies that will play a significant role in that. So that's where I want to go through in terms of the programmatic side. Very quickly, before closing out here, I'll show you just a quick 2 kind of things on the last slides. Let me share my screen one more time and then open this up right here. 1 second. Just for reference. 1 second. There we go. All right. So let me go back here to the last slide. So the second demo, if you want to try that yourself, then we have the second demo available here through this QR code. Let me open this back up. So you can scan this QR code. This will actually open up, again, the deployment of that second demo that I went through using Particle Connect. Both of these you can try yourself. Super simple, kind of the same mechanism that I just showed you. You just have to get some Sepoy ETH for Linea, and you can do transactions, try it out yourself. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about Particle, you have our Twitter there and our website right there. Like I mentioned, our kind of main goal here is to improve user experience and sort of set the stage from multiple different angles, from social logins to account abstraction to chain abstraction, to kind of set the stage here for kind of mass consumer onboarding. And of course, Linea has been one of the main chains we've supported for quite a while, and we are one of the largest account abstraction providers on Linea. We've done some pretty big campaigns on Linea in the past, and we support a lot of the kind of top projects that are building on Linea as well, which we're very excited about, and that we've been very happy to support the Linea ecosystem with these kind of tools, and hopefully contribute in our own way to kind of bringing Linea to the mainstream as well, from that perspective. So yeah, that's kind of about it for me in terms of understanding kind of the landscape here and the pragmatic implementation of these technologies.
Woof, that was a fire hose of information, but actually super interesting. There's a lot of sexy pieces. I mean, when you're talking about the universal account thing, I was super excited. I was like, does this exist yet? So it's good to know that you guys just launched testnet. I think like one housekeeping thing is for all the I guess QR codes, do you also have like the hard links to like GitHub repos and things like that we can store and like flash on the screen? Because I guess some people might be watching through mobile, so they can't really scan.
That's
Um,
true. I think
yeah.
I should be able to actually throw those links maybe into the YouTube chat or something of that nature.
You
I
can
can grab
send
them
it
real
in the
quick.
private chat, and then
Gotcha.
I can blast it everywhere. Because that is the power
Perfect.
of this multi-streaming platform. Um,
Sounds good.
yeah, so I was gonna ask a few questions just to like I feel like you covered this, but this is more of a let me how do I put this? Like, I think there's a lot of like smart contract or like wallet providers that do a really good job of creating that seamless experience for web 2 devs or users, right? But I think the flip side that I've had a lot of struggle with why is this not posting? This is weird. Okay. Maybe Restream will fix itself. Uh okay. You know what? I don't know. I'll post it in like a recap post. What was I saying? Oh, yes. Okay. So I run into an issue where it's like I want to do all of these logins or let's give an example, right? So like ticketed events, I think is a really popular kind of new use case of like we want to do NFT tickets, but a lot of events have non Web3 native users. Let's use social logins to make it easy, right? The problem that we run into, I think, is like the two pieces, right? It's either completely custodied, so I don't like it's not easy for me to figure out how to like keep that information, or maybe it is self custody. I don't know. And like the other piece is like, okay, well now I have this new thing, but I actually wanted to use my MetaMask wallet that I already have rather than going through like this whole like automatically created account for me. And I think that tails into the question of like the universal account as well. Like when I first heard universal, I was like, oh, does this mean now I can like link up all of my random wallets that I have everywhere to control all at once? Um, because that's the interface that I want. And that's, I guess, something that's very relevant for a Web3 native user, but not super relevant for someone who's just onboarding because they don't exist in my world. Where I'm like, okay, well now how do I pull all
Right.
this together? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting kind of like, I think a big part of the problem at the moment is that there's just like not really a like, I mean, I don't mean to say the word universal again, but there's not really like a unified standard, I guess, in terms of like how wallets are managed. And like I think a lot of these applications that they have like good intentions in terms of using social logins, but a lot of them, like especially like ticketing platforms or things that they really want to interface with consumers, what happens sometimes that they actually focus too much on consumers and forget about Web3 natives that, like you said, maybe want to use MetaMask or wallets they're already kind of, they have their funds on already, right? Or they want the NFT to be on. So like I think this is where, for example, like hopefully what we see is that like there's going to be this kind of movement of, ideally in this kind of world where the lines between Web 2 and Web 3 are blurred, the really only differentiator is going to be that whenever you log into a Web3 application, you just have this kind of added section of like connect your wallet, right? The actual like standard onboarding process will be the same for Web2 and Web3 through social logins. But in terms of these specific, like additional onboarding functionalities, you'll have for all these Web3 applications the ability to, okay, connect my MetaMask or my Phantom wallet or whatever it may be. And this is like, kind of the reason we built Particle Connect SDK is to kind of be an implementation of that to some degree, because we really do encourage developers to build with that. Because I mean, it's just a lot more equitable. And even if they are like building with Particle Auth for exclusive social logins, we almost always like encourage them to build a modal where it's like you have social logins and you need to have a mechanism for people to onboard via normal wallets. And this goes for all applications. If you're just building like a DeFi protocol, usually that's more self-explanatory. But if you're building like a very consumer-facing application like an NFT ticketing platform or anything of this nature, then I think it's very important to make sure that you're catering towards both audiences. But you also do have the problem of like wallet fragmentation. And this is something that like we've also thought a little bit about in terms of like how do you solve this idea of like I think I have not just like different balances across different chains. I have different wallets across different chains. So I'm using Phantom for Solana. I'm using MetaMask for ETH. I'm using Kepler for Cosmos. I'm using Unisat for Bitcoin. And like, what do I do here, right? So one thing that we've understood, like I think it's in terms of like the way that we see it is we do see a lot of it more from the standpoint, like you mentioned, of like new users that are getting into Web3 that like have like a fresh perspective, or like a fresh kind of like kind of state of zero. Whereas like when they actually create a universal account, one idea that we have is that they really should just use the mechanism that they onboarded through for everything. So if they onboarded through MetaMask, then they should use MetaMask for every chain. They shouldn't have to download different wallets. So for example, if they go to Solana, they should be able to use MetaMask for Solana. They should be able to use it for Bitcoin. They should be able to use it for Cosmos. And they shouldn't have to worry about, does this wallet support this different chain? And they should just have one wallet with one address for every different blockchain and have one balance that spans every different blockchain. So what we're actually going to be doing is, I didn't mention this, but universal accounts will also have this mechanism of using actual like MPC nodes, kind of similar to chain signatures a little bit, kind of like what Near is doing, if you've ever heard of that. But basically for us, we're going to have kind of users be able to leverage accounts on these like non-EVM chains with social logins, an EVM wallet, or even a non-EVM wallet. And you can basically have like, your main address, you have your balances on EVM chains, and through the same wallet modal, you can see, for example, your BTC on Bitcoin. But when I'm doing a transaction with that BTC on Bitcoin, actually in the back end, what we're doing is we're kind of leveraging an address that is computationally tied to your overall address that you still own, like through the proxy of like that computational, being tied to your address. And then you kind of through that nature actually have that balance within your universal account. Of course, it's on a different address or different account, but it's still bound to you. And then we can kind of handle how we actually do transactions in that sense, like on the back end. So it's all removed from the end user. But the idea here is that they can kind of leverage this single wallet interface, whether it be social logins or any wallet that they want to use, and then as a result, be able to kind of leverage wallets and kind of different mechanisms across every different chain, EVM or not. And this is kind of the idea where we want to have this experience where users don't need to manage multiple wallets, multiple bounce across different chains, and of course have the option of kind of simple social logins and whatnot. And we hope that for new users specifically, this will be a pretty big kind of point for getting into Web3. But there's definitely still the issue of like Web3 natives. It's hard to kind of do a lot of this retroactively. I think this kind of next generation of Web3 users are going to have it much easier than what a lot of us do at the moment.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I shouldn't make everyone make tailored solutions for our little small club.
Yeah, it's much
um,
smaller than most people think. I think there's very few people in Web3 than most people think it's much bigger than it actually is. I think there's, there's this report. It's pretty good by I forget the organization, Electric Capital. I think in total they measure about 25,000 developers in the space, and it's like it feels like there's a lot more than that. But I think the Web3 still has a long way to grow in terms of developers, in terms of users, and hopefully this will play a little bit of a role in that.
okay. Awesome. Well, this was super informative. Oh my god, I think my brain is slightly broken. You guys are doing a lot of different things. I didn't realize like you guys had the whole component also of being like plug and play, which was super cool. I really like I think especially in the like wallet account abstraction space. Like from a I guess I haven't played very deeply with any of them. I always feel like I'm like, okay, well I have to choose one and decide between like how everything works together, but I found it interesting that you guys can pull in, like, Biconomy and, like, all these other services. If I remind me correctly, is this specifically for, like, the paymaster component?
You
Um,
can you can use like for paymasters and bundle like kind of the three pieces of modular infrastructure that you typically look at. So like things that can be swapped out. You look at the smart account implementation, which is like the actual wallet that you're using, the like the contract that you're using for your account. This can be Biconomy, CyberConnect, Alchemy's Light account, Simple account, SafeCore, Zero Dev, stuff like that. Then for paymasters, you can also use other providers like Biconomy, StackUp, and so on. Then for the bundlers, you can also use a multitude of other providers. We have our own infrastructure for this, but we have a lot of users that they want to use Biconomy because, I mean, Biconomy is awesome. So they can use them or they can use Alchemy or anything like that. So that flexibility is we found to be pretty important for a lot of developers. Just this kind of principle of being open and being modular in terms of the stack that you can use.
yes, I love to hear that. That's amazing. Okay, we are around time, so I guess we can end things here and then post the information everywhere for people who weren't able to attend live. And I guess hear from you. I guess maybe the next last piece is like, is anything interesting coming up for Particle? Ways for people to interact. Like, are you gonna be IRL anywhere? Um,
Sure. Yeah. We were just, of course, in we were in Korea, then we were in Hong Kong, and then originally we were going to do this session a little while ago in Dubai, but it was crazy. I was stuck in this mall, and like water was falling through the roof, and I couldn't get back to my hotel. I ended up like after we canceled it, like a 2-hour trek through the flooding back to the hotel because there was no Ubers. It was a crazy experience, but that was the last event that we attended. We did a bunch of stuff out there, and then now we're getting ready for consensus. So I'll be out there. We're doing a few kind of events we're going to do one with Agoric and a few other guys that are kind of in the same account abstraction, chain abstraction space. So we're going to be doing that later this May. We're also going to be at ECC. We're going to be at Token 2049 Singapore. Probably going to be at DevCon later this year, stuff like that. So we're kind of all over the place. You can usually find me wearing a particle shirt somewhere. I'm definitely always happy to chat. And we have a lot of pretty crazy things happening over the next, really just 2 months. Of course, we just did testnet for universal accounts. We're going to be doing another phase of testnet, which expands functionality even further, really just in 2 or 3 weeks. Then going into the rest of this year, we're going to be doing mainnet and a bunch of other things, and we're hoping to kind of end off Q3 with a full mainnet implementation of universal accounts, having this kind of start to be implemented across the ecosystem. So you can expect a lot of us in that regard as well. So yeah, pretty excited. And again, thank you for having me on. I always love these sessions. I watch these all the time. I was watching the one from Covalent just the other day, and they were super solid. So glad that we had the opportunity to kind of go through this today, and I appreciate it.
I'm like, oh no, please don't watch my old stuff. I'm embarrassed. Yes, okay. And one last piece, Linea is kicking off our May Dev Cook-Off. So I don't know if you know this, Tabasco, but we started monthly hackathons. We just closed off our April one and we had like 40 submissions, which is pretty cool. So for May, we're starting a new one. And if you read the instructions, you get bonus points for integrating partners. I think adding Particle would be a super like smooth-brained way of capturing the bonus points, improving your dApps, things like that. So keep in mind, I don't think I've released registration information, but yeah, if you know, it's coming up. Submissions are due May 31st. Integrate Particle. And then I have the GitHub link that I'll post and like edit the things. So yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'm gonna wave goodbye and hit end stream, and we'll see you wherever, I guess, consensus and all the conferences that are basically coming up. Yeah.